ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas includes the release of all Israeli captives over 3 phases and a complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. The first phase calls for 33 Israeli captives to be exchanged for nearly 2,000 Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons. Well, so far, Palestinian factions have released 19 Israeli captives, while Israel has freed 1,135 Palestinians. 2 more exchanges are expected to take place during this phase, one next weekend and another on March the 1st. The second phase of the agreement is due to begin on the same day. During phase 2, the remaining 59 Israeli captives are to be exchanged for more Palestinian prisoners. At least 35 of the Israelis have been confirmed dead. As part of phase 2, Israeli forces are to fully withdraw from Gaza and a permanent ceasefire is to be established. Hamas and Israel are expected to hold indirect negotiations on the implementation of this phase early next week. Well, joining us in the studio is Abdullah, al-Arian, an associate professor at Georgetown University here in Qatar. Abdullah, always good to see you. So as I've just described there, we've had these now 6 captive exchanges. We know that negotiations for the implementation of phase 2 are in the offing, if they haven't begun on a much lower ranking level already. But where does all of this leave the prospect of this ceasefire actually being fully implemented as we go along?
Well, I think there's some important concerns and questions that have been raised over this first phase. And one of that, I think, those questions is whether Israel is really serious about proceeding to this next phase, because it would require it to fully withdraw from a territory that it continues to see itself very much as wanting to maintain a occupation, if not a full resumption of the genocidal war that it had unleashed for 16 months. I mean, let's consider the fact that that same deal was on the table for over a year, and Israel had rejected it. And it's basically the same terms, in part because it wanted to continue this campaign. And the only reason it relented was for 2 sets of pressures, one coming domestically from the families of the captives, and secondly coming from the United States, from the incoming Trump administration, which essentially did some arm twisting in order to get Israeli acceptance. But now what we're seeing is that there's a kind of almost a partial acceptance of let's just stick to this first phase because it would relieve some of that pressure, but without having to actually fulfill any of its obligations. And so we haven't seen it actually take the necessary steps, as we've just seen in that report, as far as giving Palestinians the very basics necessary for life, particularly under these horrific conditions and in this winter weather.
The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in the region, first stop Tel Aviv. He's also going to Qatar, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. He must be well aware of the firm Arab opposition to Donald Trump's plan to control Gaza, to essentially force Palestinians out. So what next?
Well, I think, this is very typical for, Trump administration kind of policymaking strategies, which is to kind of start with this incredibly outlandish, unworkable, kind of non-starter of a proposal, knowing everything that we know as far as the Palestinians not wanting to be moved from their land. And then, of course, the Arab states that have all signaled that they're unwilling to even entertain this notion temporarily even. But what we're seeing potentially is a shift now in emphasis from this to potentially other resolutions. And what we're seeing is a resumption of some of the conversations that have been taking place over the course of the last year or so that would, think up various scenarios for the outcome in Gaza. Now, this would involve potentially a foreign occupation force potentially made up of different Arab states. We've heard about the resumption of the Palestinian Authority. We've heard of many different scenarios that would essentially continue to treat the people of Gaza as prisoners in their own land, as we've seen for the previous decade. And of course, all of this would be supervised by the US and Israel. So this, of course, I think is the next stage of these discussions, and certainly something to be concerned about, particularly because it excludes the Palestinians themselves, that everyone seems to be having a solution for the post-war plans in Gaza, except for the Palestinians themselves, who are not being consulted in any meaningful way.
All right, Abdullah, always good to hear your thoughts. Many thanks for that. Abdullah al-Arian there.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.